Welcome, everyone, to Demystifying Disaster Recovery in the Hybrid Cloud. I practiced saying that several times ahead of time because that's a mouthful. But essentially, we're here today to talk all things DR and hybrid cloud related. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Meredith Reich. I run customer success at Arpio, and I will be acting as a moderator today. One housekeeping note before we get into it, I just want to call out that we do have our live chat turned on. It's private, so you won't be able to see everyone's chats, but we do want to encourage questions. We want to have a conversation about DR in the hybrid cloud and hopefully make this a learning session. So I encourage everyone, send through questions in the chat as we get going. We'll be kind of triaging them as we go, and we'll plan to leave hopefully plenty of time in the end to get to any questions that we don't get to during the presentation. So with that said, I think we can go ahead and jump in, and I want to introduce you to our speakers. First up, we have Doug Neumann, who is co-founder and CEO of Arpio. And Daniel Covey, who is a solution architect at AWS, specializing in disaster recovery. So do you guys want to tell us a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. It's great to be here today. Appreciate the intro. I am Doug. I'm one of the founders of Arpio, and I am a cloud engineer for the past dozen years or so. But my story is that I'm actually relatively new to DR as a discipline. I ran a software team previously that was operating workloads in the cloud, and we had a major incident, and it was a real eye-opener for me when I realized that everything we'd been doing about fantastic multi-AZ high availability within the workloads, it wasn't sufficient. We didn't have enough resilience yet. So Arpio is born out of that personal experience, and is how I really came to bring together the worlds of disaster recovery and cloud. So Daniel, you've been doing DR for a while, though.
Yeah. My name is Daniel Covey. I am a disaster recovery specialist solutions architect, hence why we kind of knocked that down a little bit. We take up the whole slide with my title. But I've been in the disaster recovery space for just about a decade now. Been at AWS for about 4.5 years as a disaster recovery specialist. So happy to be here to speak about disaster recovery, resiliency, and how we can work together with Arpio to come up with a great DR solution.
Great.
Awesome.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and dive in, and we'll get started with the content. All right. Quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with this general conversation about resilience and hybrid cloud and how you realize resilience within the hybrid cloud. We'll dive in then and talk about DR strategies for both the on-prem portion of hybrid workloads and the cloud side of hybrid workloads, and how it is that you achieve a great resilience capability for both of those and how they play together. And that's really going to come together when we talk about testing. Testing is obviously critical for any DR investment. And so we'll talk about how it is that you validate your DR capabilities for your hybrid environments, and then wrap up with a conversation of partial failures. What happens if it's only a small portion of your environment that you need to recover? And how is it that you enable that granular recovery for these hybrid workloads? So all that said, no conversation about resilience with an AWS audience is complete without this quote from Amazon CTO Werner Vogels. Everything fails all the time. I think Werner was talking about the scale of infrastructure that Amazon operates is just so vast that failure is just happening continuously. But Daniel, you said it really great in one of our warm-up meetings for this. It's not really a question of when will failure, if failure will happen. It's a question of when failure will happen.
Right. Yeah. It's really a mindset of realizing what we can plan for whatever we think can happen, but what we really want to do is assume it's going to happen and make sure that we can plan ahead of time to mitigate that any sort of impact to the business.
Yeah.
So definitely a mindset shift at some points.
Yeah, certainly. And that mindset kind of comes down to 3 pillars. I always liken this to a stool. The stool is not stable if you don't have 3 legs on it. And an infrastructure is not stable without these three pillars of resilience here. And so, it starts with high availability. I think everybody is interested in how do we make investments that eliminate the opportunity for failure. But disaster recovery is just as important for that, and it comes into play in different scenarios and whatnot. And, Daniel, I'm kind of curious because at AWS, I imagine you guys get these questions a lot. How is it that you guys are advising your clients to think about the balance of investment between HA and DR?
Yeah, so there's multiple facets to the conversation, right? You want to look at finding out what your most critical workloads are, what does it need to be up all the time, what the impact to the business is going to be if there's some sort of impairment, and then looking at that both high availability and disaster recovery are separate pieces, right? So high availability being ensuring that we have the ability to withstand any sort of faults or impairments and so forth. And then for those events where we have some sort of larger type situation where we have no longer have access to those workloads, we then have our disaster recovery plan to recover in that manner. So that can be things like application, bad code deployments, ransomware, malware, etc. That's where disaster recovery really comes into play to assist and build up the high availability workloads. And then, of course, with that continuous improvement, it's only it's not just a one and done, right? You want to be constantly validating, you want to be constantly testing, adjusting, fine tuning, right? There's always things that you can do to make the overall stool simpler, more cost effective, et cetera.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think one of the greatest lessons I learned in the last 5 years was just the value of a great root cause analysis after an outage and understanding what is the improvement opportunity so that we can, eliminate the outage in the first place or improve the recovery times should a similar kind of event happen. But at a high level, I think HA will mitigate a certain set of failure scenarios. And sometimes that's scenarios that, obviously, that's always going to be scenarios that you're anticipating because you're investing to mitigate them. There's a set of scenarios that HA can't mitigate. And, the ransomware example you gave is there. And then I think there's also the scenarios that we just didn't anticipate or we chose not to invest in. And those are when disaster recovery really comes into play. That's what saves your bacon in those particular events. So, talking about DR, I think, we do talk about business continuity and disaster recovery. We kind of use these terms interchangeably in the industry. I think DR oftentimes focuses a little bit more on the IT technology side of a broader realm of business continuity. But I find people are really focused on these natural disaster, these weather events I often talk about, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or ice storm, things like that. And honestly, those oftentimes result in technical failures that, could be that a data center loses connectivity to the internet or loses power or something like that. But at a high level, I think, and I say high level, on another side of the coin, there's this whole spectrum of human actions that can lead to disasters. And sometimes those are accidental. Daniel, I don't know, have you ever run a test command in production accidentally?
I think we're recording this,
Yeah.
so I'm not. Yeah, I've definitely heard of it happening.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Well, I will own up to having done that myself multiple times. It's not a fun thing. But there's also malicious acts, whether that is malware, ransomware, or disgruntled employee doing unfathomable things, or just a bad actor gets in the environment and chooses to give you a bad day. Those kinds of events can be existential for a business. And so in a lot of ways, these investments are like buying insurance, life insurance, to make sure that your business will live to see another day.
Right. And yeah, and we have a question in chat just real quick that I get all the time, which is, I've already got HA, do I need DR, right? And that's kind of why we're having this type of conversation, because HA is again great to keep you running and everything, but HA, unless you invest a ton of money into it, is not going to assist you with a natural disaster. and it's not going to help with ransomware, malware, corrupted database, things like that that are automatically replicated in a high availability situation. And so DR really comes in as that last effort to ensure that the business can continue running without having a bunch of data loss. So they are you having one is good, having both is better, and then of course iterating is best, right? So.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
So we're talking today about hybrid cloud, and we wanted to just sort of level set on what does that really mean. It's perhaps not too much debate about this, but we'll come back to this mental model throughout the conversation. So fundamentally, this comes down to we have on-prem workloads and we have workloads running in AWS, and they're internetworked and communicating with each other. In all the examples we'll talk about today, Transit Gateway is the hub of this hub and spoke connectivity. That's what we see most customers doing to enable their hybrid environments. And so starting with that foundationally, we wanted to introduce just a high-level mental model for how you think about disaster recovery for a hybrid cloud. And Daniel, the way I describe this is in a hybrid environment, you have multiple infrastructures. Your data center infrastructure is distinct from your cloud infrastructure. You might have multiple data centers, you might have multiple clouds, but those infrastructures will suffer infrastructure failures independently. And you want to be able to recover those independently in that particular case. But then there's another class of disasters, which we call out as cyber disasters, but honestly, it could be just, an errant code deployment or something like that, that can span both halves of the hybrid cloud here. And in those particular cases, we need a recovery path that allows us to fail them over together and recover them together. And so what we're going to talk about here is how do you build both halves of that in a way that they then can come together to recover from this full spectrum of outages for you. So we'll start by talking about the on-prem disaster recovery strategies. And coming back to our mental model here, where we've got a hybrid cloud set up here. On-premises disaster recovery for decades was all about having a second premises, being able to replicate your environment into a different data center where you've got, a bunch of idle servers waiting by, hoping that you would never need them. So, and I think Daniel's, we'll dive in a little bit, the real innovation that you guys have introduced with the Elastic Disaster Recovery product at AWS, which is previously Cloud Indoor, is that you no longer have to buy a second data center that you hope you'll never need. You can leverage the cloud on demand for that capability. And the way this
exactly, yep. A lot simpler and a lot more cost effective as well.
Totally more cost effective, yes. The technology that we see people using most here, because you can do this at different layers, but simply replicating virtual machines or physical machines even in the data center into the cloud, running as EC2 instances, gives you a very effective, inexpensive mechanism where you can restore your entire cloud environment, or as much of your entire on-prem environment, or as much of it as you deem necessary for a DR, quite easily with a single simple solution. And that gets us to I guess I forgot this part. This is actually critical. When you do fail over, the last part, like recovering is a matter of actually just bringing up these systems. Failing over is a matter of now reconnecting the on-prem or recovered on-prem workloads and the cloud side workloads. And typically the way you would do this is by taking that connection that previously went from your data center to the transit gateway and rewiring that now to go to your recovered environment using potentially another transit gateway. This allows you to even preserve all of the IP addresses of all of those servers when you fail over, so that the communication that's happening between these environments doesn't necessarily have to be reconfigured. The applications can just continue operating once this link is reestablished. So Daniel, you work on this Elastic Disaster Recovery solution at AWS. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, definitely. So AWS Elastic Disaster Recovery, or AWS DRS, it's basically at a super high level, it's a server replication tool. We take any source environment, whether it's on-prem, AWS, other cloud, and we replicate those workloads into AWS, right? So we make it super simple, super low cost, and easy to fail over because you're not having to rebuild, right? You just launched your machines as they were in your source environment, right? And so what that does is it allows us to have faster recovery times. We're talking minutes, right? Not hours or days, sub-second recovery points, and lower cost, right? And so when we say lower cost, we'll get into an architecture diagram here in a little bit. We won't dive too deep, but we'll just give you a visual on it. But in general, what it means is you're not replicating one-to-one. You're not having to pay for OS or database licensing costs. There's a lot of cost benefits to doing this in what's called a pilot light scenario. Only a small subset of replication instances are going to be there. And then ransomware recovery and ease of testing. All of these are built into the tool. We'll go into it, but all it does is make the entire process much simpler than having, say, a data center to data center type DR solution.
Great. So this is what it looks like.
Yes. This is what it looks like. And so, like I said, we'll dive too deep into this, but I just want to point out a couple of key areas, right? On the left, you've got your source environment, which I'm currently talking about on-prem, can be AWS. And in the middle, you've got your staging area. Staging area is managed by the DRS tool. We handle spinning up of individual replication servers, EBS volumes, handling all of the replication through the service itself. And again, it's low cost, right? So it's a couple of T3 smalls and EBS volumes compared to having a one-to-one ratio, right? Now, when you're replicating, it's doing it's a real-time replication. So any changes made to source is replicated across. So you've got that sub-second recovery point. And then if you need to recover to an older snapshot, so in the case of something like ransomware or malware or something like that, where maybe you don't trust the most recent data set, or maybe there's an issue with the most recent data set, you can fail back to older snapshots every 10 minutes, every hour, every day. You have older ones that you can choose from. And then when you're ready to fail over, you can fail over into your recovery subnet and you launch full production level machines in your DR environment. Not shown on the screen is also the drill area, which is a VPC that you can spin up and launch your machines into actually do testing, which, as we know, is always fun when it comes to your DR plan. But we also make testing very simple, right? And then once it's all done, you fail back to on-prem, right? You fail back to your source environment. You replicate just the changes back. You repoint your traffic. You repoint that transit gateway, and you're back operating at your source environment. Overall, very simple from the high level, and quick, easy, and happy to go into that further if we need more further conversation.
Yeah, awesome. So this is a fabulous native capability for disaster recovery built into AWS these days. So it's great to have that on the platform. We're going to talk now about how you do the DR on the cloud side. And my assertion here is what's really fundamentally different in the cloud is that there's new dimensions of complexity that we never had to deal with on premises before. And so if you think about like a on-premises environment, largely boils down to a set of servers that you're running. Sometimes you're thinking about actual database replication for DR strategies, but you can use server replication to protect a complete on-prem environment. In the cloud, you end up getting much more heterogeneity. So you might start with servers. You might evolve into containers. You might start to take advantage of serverless. You've got managed networking and security settings and identity and auto scaling and load balancing and just a bunch of new concepts. And you've got to contemplate, how are we going to pull all of this stuff together? So ultimately, the strategy that people use for DR for their cloud side workloads is typically to replicate that workload into another region and rebuild their entire environment at the point in time when they actually need to recover. So they're replicating data, and they've got various manual and automated processes which go into actually recreating the systems and restoring the data onto those systems if they ever need those things. And then ultimately, just like we did with the on-prem failover, once we've rebuilt that environment, we need to link these up again. And so ultimately the recovery process happens when we create the environment. The failover process happens when we relink these things, and we have to get our network engineering team involved to update the routers to send traffic that previously were going on the left side over to the right side as part of that. And this is where Arpio comes into this whole conversation, because Arpio takes the complexity of recreating a cloud environment and makes it a simple problem. And it does that by orchestrating the native mechanisms that are built into AWS. So every different service in AWS has a different story to tell about disaster recovery, and Arpio understands how to coordinate those. So Daniel, like Arpio uses elastic disaster recovery under the covers to replicate EC2 instances, but it can also extend that to replicate RDS using RDS data replication or snapshotting, and it can handle Dynamo and S3, and then it also handles all the infrastructure around it and things like passwords in the secrets manager and users in Cognito and all of that kind of complexity that our customers otherwise have to figure out how to cobble that together, giving themselves the ability to recover into a different region, to recover into a locked down environment so that their recovery capability is protected from a bad actor, and to make it really easy to get back up and running or to run a test through full automation.
That's something that we find a lot is that, you know, when we're talking about DR, it can be very focused on the workloads themselves and not the surrounding pieces, right? You know, again, networking, routing, access, right? So having these types of conversations is, you know, how am I going to get both my on-prem EC2 instances plus, or my on-prem VMs plus my EC2 instances all to fail over, plus my services that I'm running in AWS. So these types of conversations that we have get wider and wider. So having these conversations early on really helps build a more robust.
Yeah, I often tell people backup is about your data, recovery is about your environment. And so you can't get back online until you've recreated all of that stuff that goes with it. So the way Arpio handles this is it can identify within your AWS account, it can identify all the systems that you're using, all these different resources, infrastructure resources, data resources, and things in between. And it knows what the unique approaches are for continuously replicating each of those into a recovery environment. That recovery environment, again, is typically in a different region of AWS and typically into a different AWS account that has different security access and can be totally locked down. So, you know, it's protected from a cyber event. Arpio keeps all that stuff turned off, so you don't have to pay for it while you're not using it. And that allows you to really mitigate a lot of the costs associated with maintaining a DR strategy. But they can bring it up as quickly as all these services can launch themselves. So, you know, Daniel, when we bring up an EC2 instance that's being replicated by Elastic Disaster Recovery, you know, it takes about 5 minutes for you guys to launch a new server into that recovery environment. So it's very quick to get back online. And the same thing goes for RDS and you know, Elasticache, Dynamo, all these other services that need to come up as part of that recovery process.
Right.
Lastly, though, Arpio knows how to fail back when that disaster has cleared. So, you know, most of our customers don't intend to leave their production region, their production account. They just need to get back up and running. But long term, they want to restore their workloads back to where they were. And so Arpio understands how to take the data alone and recover that to the existing infrastructure in the original environment so that you can return the data back there and you know, keep going. So, so with all that context set, I think it's really important that we talk today about cyber recovery and ransomware in particular, because this is driving so many people's investments and the risks that they're trying to mitigate these days. And cyber recovery looks a little bit different than what traditional disaster recovery has looked like. So first, and you mentioned this already, Daniel, when you are recovering from a ransomware attack, you need historical data. If your server got encrypted and you replicated that, then you've replicated encrypted data. So you need the ability to go back in time and get to the data from prior to when that ransomware was introduced into the environment. But you also need to make sure that you actually have those backups when you need them. And when a bad actor gets into your account for ransomware or other reasons, they understand that your ability to recover from the attack is based on your backups. And so they will seek out your backups and do whatever they can to compromise those, be it them deleting them or ransomwaring them along with everything else. And so it's really important to make sure that you've protected those and stored them outside of the production environment in a way that they are not vulnerable. Lastly, when a bad actor gets into your account, you have to, at least for a while, assume that that environment cannot be trusted. And so you want to embrace a recovery strategy that allows you to rebuild your systems in a clean environment that has not been compromised, rather than rebuilding in place only to find that there's some backdoor installed or some existing mechanism that you didn't discover that they're taking advantage of to get into your environment. So the big difference with ransomware and cyber recovery, really it's about the security boundaries. So instead of replicating into the same AWS account that we have previously shown in the earlier slides, we want to make sure that we're actually able to replicate our data and store that bunkered in a way that has very limited access. When we talk to customers at Arpio about this, Daniel, we tell them, like, nobody needs access to this environment. You'll set up the solution. Arpio is going to be leveraging DRS and other techniques to replicate the data into this environment, but nobody needs day-to-day access to this environment. That just shuts down all of these attack vectors that otherwise might exist, that allows your recovery capability to be undermined.
100%, yeah.
And then when it happens, so with a cyber attack, we have to assume that these, as I mentioned earlier, these two halves of the hybrid cloud are going to get compromised together. So we need the ability to recover them together. And so we use these same techniques that we had before to recreate this entire environment. But in this case, we can network them directly together rather than having a hybrid approach that we'd shown previously. Once we've reestablished that connectivity, these systems can pick up and continue running just as they were before. So that's fundamentally what's different on the cyber side, and how you put together a strategy for being resilient to both infrastructure failures and human actions that might cause outages for you. So I think the next question that I hear a lot is, okay, I've built out this stuff, but how am I actually going to test it? I need to be able to test these things in a way that does not require me to shut down my business. I have to figure out how to test these things in parallel with actually taking active traffic on the production systems. And that can be really hard in a hybrid environment if you think about all these interdependencies between the cloud side and the on-prem side. So fundamentally, we've got our hybrid environment here. We're going to set up testing by replicating both of these things together into our recovery environment. And we'll continue to take traffic on the left-hand side. The entire business is up and running over on the left, while we do some smoke testing to validate that our recovered environment on the right-hand side is working successfully. So it's simply just taking those two halves and executing them together. And while we're doing this, we're going to continue, there's no impact on our production environment. But there is, everybody has concerns. Well, what's going to happen actually when I clone my recovery environment or my production environment? I bring it up in a recovery environment, and those applications start to do things. And so the technique that we help people employ, and that there's a lot of different ways you can accomplish, is to build out what's oftentimes called a bubble network. Effectively wrap these recovery environments in network controls that prevent the workloads inside of them from actually reaching out and in communicating with either the production systems on the left or with third-party systems that aren't depicted in the diagram here. So Daniel, how are you guys advising people about how they do that with the DRS testing these days?
Yeah, so it's again, as with most DR conversations, it's multifaceted, right? You want to take a look at what you consider to be a good test, right? And so if you want to test often, you can test ensuring that you can launch machines properly within your RTO, your recovery time objective, that the data that you're expecting to be there is there. Those are types of tests that you can do very quickly, and those could be like monthly type tests. And so what we tell them, what we tell customers is to have multiple checkpoints for the types of tests you want to do. We can't all be like Netflix where you're doing production level testing and so forth all the time. So you want to find out a good balance of what type of failure mode you're looking at, how you can test for those, and then utilizing DRS, you can launch those instances, those servers with Arpio being the orchestrator, and launch them in that bubble network, and again, not interrupt that production replication, right? So it makes it very simple, but mainly it's defining the goal, defining multiple levels of goals, multiple tiers of testing, and then planning based on that.
Yeah, exactly. And I know we help customers set up these bubble networks as part of their tests. And you can do it with network ACLs. Arpio will automate it by using security groups to quarantine everything that's in these and ensure that they can't communicate outside of the bubble here, and make it really easy for you to ensure that you can validate your recovery environment without having any impact on your production workloads. So the last topic we want to talk about today is partial recovery. I get this question all the time. And I think a lot of it is because since Arpio focuses on recovery for the cloud side of these environments, oftentimes the impairments customers are dealing with is only impacting a small number of their services. And they want to be able to recover those services in completely different infrastructure in a different region of the cloud without having to move all of the unimpaired services as well. They want to figure out what's the right strategy to be able to communicate between the recovery environment and the primary or production environment. And so ultimately, this comes down to one simple premise here, which is that in this particular case, we need to make sure that workloads in the recovery environment and workloads in the production environment can talk to each other. And that means that we have to connect them through networking. And once those are connected through networking, that means that the systems have to have unique network identity. They have to have unique IP addresses. So everything we've talked about beforehand, where we're focused on really failing over the cloud side or the on-prem side, and we aren't communicating left to right on those diagrams, that we can preserve IP addresses in those cases. We can preserve network identity, and we can do that in such a way that the applications themselves don't have to be reconfigured to know about different IP addresses. In this partial failover scenario, though, you no longer have that. And that means that systems are in environments where there's a lot of oftentimes legacy applications which have baked IP configurations into config files on servers and whatnot, get very difficult to actually achieve this with. And oftentimes we find ourselves encouraging customers to take the big step of being able to fail over everything and then layer on the follow-up steps of being able to fail over individual pieces of it. The way that you ultimately mature beyond this is through DNS. So decoupling applications from IP addresses, or on the cloud side, sometimes it's from the managed host names that you'll get when you launch an RDS service or something like that. And having DNS, either aliases or just DNS entries that you can update as part of that process. So what this looks like, go back to our diagram here. We've got a recovery environment, and during the recovery process, we'll fail over either the top half or the bottom half, depending on what it is that we're trying to recover from, or maybe we'll fail over both of them if they're both impaired, although that's typically not necessary since these are individual infrastructures, and these are typically infrastructure failures we're recovering from. And once that's in place, we just need to connect these things together. You'll note that our VPCs on the left have different CIDR blocks than the VPCs on the right. And the on-prem data center on the left has different CIDR range than the on-prem recovery VPC on the right. And so we're able to launch systems within these, and they have unique IP addresses now at this point in time. And then lastly, we have to take on updating DNS records so that a communication that a server that previously communicated to another system that sat in the same part of our environment can easily now communicate with a system that's in another part of our environment. And you could do this by just going and updating all the IP addresses everywhere, but it's a whole lot easier if you've centralized that stuff in DNS. So through that investment, you can achieve what, I oftentimes consider nirvana with our customers, and have a comprehensive DR strategy for their hybrid cloud environments. It makes it easy to do granular recoveries or comprehensive recoveries as necessary. So I think we're wrapping up here. I think the last thing to touch base on is what else, like what's the call to action for people here? And so Daniel, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's don't forget about disaster recovery. Keep in mind that disaster recovery is intended to protect your environments, protect your business in cases where other resilience investments have fallen short. So high availability is certainly an important part of workloads these days. And it's in a lot of ways easier to achieve in the cloud than it was ever possible to achieve on premises. But you still have surface areas of risks, and ransomware, one we keep coming back to, is a fantastic example where high availability does not protect you, does not mean that you'll be able to get your workloads back up and running.
It's also workload dependent, right? Like it can be that you don't need HA for your time clock, right? But you do want to make sure that you can recover your time clock. Your clock in software. My brain is not working right now, apparently.
Yeah.
Right. You may not need that high availability, but you do want to be able to access that if there's some sort of power outage or what have you, and that's where DR is going to come into, right? So definitely helpful on its own, but high availability for your critical workloads. Exactly.
Yeah. If you don't have HA in place, you definitely need DR, and even if you have HA in place, you need some DR.
Yeah.
So, and Arpio, we're experts in doing this. We help people. We have our product is all about the cloud side of this problem, but in helping customers solve the holistic problem, we spend a lot of time talking to them about these hybrid environments and thinking through the complexities of individual environments. And boy, there's some nasty enterprise networks out there that aren't an easy thing to think through. So we're happy to help people do that. And everybody on the call who's an AWS customer has an account team that's there to help them successfully achieve this as well, and to give them the resources they need to make sure that they understand your product, Daniel, with the Elastic Disaster Recovery stuff and how that can help them both do on-prem into cloud workloads for non-hybrid environments, or do cloud-to-cloud workloads for cloud-only environments, or to do both in the case of the hybrid environments we've been talking about today. So I think that's kind of it for the day. We have an opportunity to take some questions.
We do have some teed up. Yeah, we do have some questions. All right. So I think a good one to start, we got a question about testing. So in a bubble network test situation, can I open up the bubble for some third-party services, like an email service, but leave it closed for other services? So, opening it up for the dev email service, but closing it for production email service.
So certainly you can do that. You can configure that in a lot of different ways. I think one of the things that you'll have to grapple with is that most of the services that are external, by a host name, but most of the bubble network techniques that are available to you require an IP address. And so you'll have to figure out how am I going to translate this host name into an IP address, which is a pretty basic command line command. You have to keep in mind that these services are rather dynamic, and that IP address can change out from underneath you. And so you might have to, grapple with that. But certainly the networking configuration of that bubble network, there's a lot of flexibility in how you set that up.
Right. Yeah, because in the end, that's just what it is. It's a lockdown network, right? It's no different than any other, VPC within AWS. But we call it a bubble network because the idea is you don't want it talking to anything unless you specifically call for it for your testing.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay, another question that came through, this one about the actual failover scenario. So is it possible to also do cross availability zone failover as well, or is it only cross region?
So yeah, you certainly can, and you get a lot of resilience within a region by having a multi-AZ approach, whether it's high availability or disaster recovery and you're failing over a workload into another availability zone. The reason why we talk mostly about cross region is just you get additional resilience there. The availability zones, Daniel, you probably know this by heart, but independent power and networking and the things that you traditionally have to be worried about, data center failures, are mitigated with multiple AZs. But certain regional services and obviously human error and things like that, that can extend beyond AZs and cause you need the requirement that you're going to fail over to another region.
Right. And not to mention just compliance requirements, right? Some obviously, if they're asking about this, probably doesn't affect them, but there's compliance requirements as well where you are not allowed to operate in the same region and things like that. So you can, it's definitely able to be done. I just want to look at what the situation is for your particular business.
Makes a lot of sense. Awesome. So we had another one just come in about costs. So what types of costs can I expect with this sort of setup, and how do I keep them at a minimum?
Anywhere between 0 and $1 million.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, typically the way I answer this is effectively like any DR solution is going to require you to store your data a second time outside of your environment. And so the majority of the costs that are associated with the steady state disaster recovery is just going to be based off how much data you've got and how much churn you have in that data, what it looks like to transfer that. If you embrace a real-time recovery point objective, which is what DRS can do for you so well, then that's more expensive than having a latent recovery point objective that would be based off of snapshots or backups or something like that. So there's a trade-off of cost and recovery point objective as well. That's pretty well understood in the enterprise. For our customers at Arpio, we oftentimes hear that their DR site costs about 3 to 5% of what their production site costs. It totally depends on the shape of the data, but those are pretty traditional, typical workloads that are balance of compute and data. You're not paying for the compute on the DR side until you're actually running a test or a recovery, at which point in time you're very happy to pay for that compute.
Yeah, and the other thing again is when we're talking about costs and so forth is not every workload is the same. Not every workload requires Arpio and RTO of 0 or what have you. So again, taking a look at your environment and your workloads and going, what is the cost benefit of having these different solutions, different services, and what have you, and really taking each workload as a singular piece and then building it together. That's how you get a really a good cost benefit analysis for a DR solution.
Awesome, great question. All right, I love all these questions, you guys. So feel free to please keep them coming. Just looking through. All right, so we have one that's Arpio specific here. The question is, it seems like Arpio's solution represents an all or nothing approach for recovering an environment from ransomware. Suppose only part of the environment has been compromised. Can one recover just certain elements in one's environment? And if so, how?
So yeah, I mean, Arpio allows you to recover the scope of the environment that you tell it to recover. And so you can define exactly what that's going to be. Now that recovery process, I think it can be challenging to understand, like, where is the malware in my environment? Obviously it's probably pretty easy to figure out where you've been ransomwared already, but we work with our customers to make sure they have a very methodical approach to bringing these systems back online, bringing them up so that they're quarantined in such a way that if they do still have malware on them, it's ineffective until you go through the process of validating that it's safe to bring them out of quarantine, and make sure that ransomware recovery is a very methodical process that can be achieved relatively quickly compared to traditional ransomware recoveries.
Yeah, I'm glad you went that route, Doug, because that's my heart rate goes up a little bit when I hear, can I only recover partial from ransomware? It's absolutely possible, but you make sure you're following the proper processes to validate the data sets, that there's nothing hidden in there and things like that. Because as you said, you can't trust production at that point.
All right. Awesome. Got one more question I'm seeing here, which is, do I need to have my transit gateways running at all times, or can I just spin them up during a disaster?
So I'll take that. You can spin them up during a disaster. So I think the reason why you would defer that is because you don't want to pay the cost of the connections to Transit Gateway. Transit Gateway connections themselves are what you pay for. You don't pay for the gateway in the hub. You pay for all the attachments to that gateway, and it has a base fee. It's actually not that expensive. I off the top of my head, I can't remember, but we're talking, I think like $30 a month or something for a Transit Gateway connection. But then you'll pay for traffic that you send across it as well. But you're not using the DR site, you're not sending traffic over it, you're probably not paying a lot for it. But if you want to defer that cost, these things come up in a minute or so. They're very quick to bring up. And if you have a good process to automate that or to do that manually, then you'll be just fine.
Great. All right. I think those are all the questions, unless it's not too late. Does anyone else have a late question? Don't be shy. If not, then I think that concludes our Q&A.
Great. Well, Daniel, I just want to thank you for spending an hour of your day with us today. So it's great to spend some time with you. Good to see you again.
Yep, Doug, Meredith, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. This was great. And to all the attendees, we'll be emailing out a recording of the session afterwards. And so please certainly take a look or reach out to us with any other questions that you didn't get answered. All right.
Awesome. Thank you much, guys.
All right. Have a great day.